taking a direction of higher debt level to fund economic growth in South Africa an option? That's what we are asking tonight. You can weigh in on 072-110-5584. Or otherwise, you can tweet us at Newzroom 405. This as we look ahead to hearing from the Minister of Finance, Minister Godongwana, delivering his maiden budget speech tomorrow. But first, though, let's look right now at what's making news. Finance Minister Godongwana is expected to detail his budget tomorrow amid concerns around growing unemployment rates. The Electoral Commission of South Africa reveals that collectively political parties received more than 46 million rands, with the governing ANC receiving 22.8 million rand. The State Assembly lawmakers grant President Vladimir Putin power to use force outside of Russia.
There's a confusion as to whether South Africa should borrow in the first place, which I say that was tabled in Parliament. Everybody knew that we were going to borrow, precisely because we tabled that as we're transparent in that regard, and say when we table the budget, here is the amount that is available which we are going to spend, here's the revenue that we're going to collect, here is the difference. Here are the debt service costs. All of that is part of the documentation we present to Parliament. So let's let's put that aside. The second set of issues is the 750 million. People are saying we were going to borrow in any event. Then people are saying, but why would you go to the World Bank? The answer is the World Bank provided us with the which is the cheapest loan, and there's no way we couldn't take it. And secondly, the terms are very good, generous terms. For example, we're going to pay that $750 million over a 13-year period. By the way, we'll be having, before we do that, a repayment holiday of 3 years. In other words, for the next 3 years, we're not going to be paying this service in this test. We'll do so in the 4th year.
Yeah.
So it's quite a generous loan for us, and it helps us in our debt reduction strategy.
Now, as we preview Finance Minister Godongwana's maiden budget speech tomorrow, we turn our focus tonight to South Africa's borrowing and rising debt level. Many are saying this is a ticking time bomb, or is it necessarily a ticking time bomb for a developing country like ours? Here to unpack this, I'm joined by Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective, Lebohang Pheko. We've also got Wits University Senior Economist Lecturer, Dr. Lumkile Mondi, as well as Professor Bonang Mohale with us here tonight. You're a part of this conversation. You can drop us your comments at 072-110-5584, or you can tweet us tonight at Newzroom 405. Good evening to you all, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus. I suppose it's a conversation many of you have been involved in, particularly in debating for some years now, but it always comes up every time we come to the budget and we have to talk about whether or not South Africa should continue to borrow. There are two schools of thought. There are those who are saying there is a threshold effect. In other words, that debt above 90% will sharply impact on growth. But there is another school that's saying, well, we should rather focus on increasing growth, and then debt reduction will really no longer be a matter. Does South Africa have an option here? Is targeting a higher debt level to support growth a policy option for South Africa? Aslebo, let's begin with you.
Thank you. So, I mean, South Africa has run at about 45, 48, so about 50 or so consecutive budget deficits, and that comes from the great meltdown of 2008, and we seem to be perpetually in a state of recovery and non-recovery. And just as I think it looked as though we might be getting on our feet, the COVID-19 pandemic, or now 2021-22 pandemic in perpetuity, took hold, although of course there have been quite a few, I would say, missteps in terms of our own policy, economic policy making prior to that. So this means in real terms that our budget deficit has increased, has doubled. Our government to debt ratio has also increased from about 24% of GDP in 2008 to just over almost 70%, almost 3 times as much in the interim. So some would argue that certainly the bailouts, the many bailouts that we're receiving now from the IMF, from the World Bank, seem to be the only way out. However, this isn't really a unique, if we look at a baseline scenario, the impact of this crisis has led to several countries asking for emergency funding. So South Africa is not unique. It's about $93 billion of funding, which were doing the rounds about a year ago, and I don't have the updated figures as of yesterday. But this does mean that I think the difference is that South Africa has a lot more resources at its disposal. So the first loan which was approved was about 1.9 billion, and this was supposedly for emergency health support. Secondly, the other tranches were supposedly for, of course, a transitional period during which it is understood that unemployment has increased, 2 million jobs have been lost. It's also understood that the levels of precarity, food insecurity, hunger, 11% more people are going to bed hungry since the beginning of the pandemic, which is extremely unfortunate, and I think I would say quite reprehensible in a society such as our own. But what is really concerning is that South Africa has several other options, in my view, that it could have taken. So, for example, expanding tax revenues, which of course is the route that I'm sure our minister is going to take, and ensuring that those revenues are directed appropriately, eliminating financial flows, increasing the efficiency and the effectiveness. And I think this is where the magic and the crux of the matter is, and of reallocation of public expenditures. And this has to go beyond your basic financial cost benefit analysis formulas that we seem to be quite fond of, and other mechanisms like tapping into fiscal and foreign exchange reserves, which we seem to be quite afraid of doing, and also putting the Reserve Bank to more dynamic use, in my view, in terms of taking more flexible and more malleable, nimble, agile, responsive steps at any given moment, either by putting money into particular economic sectors where necessary, or withdrawing money. Money where necessary. I'm not a fan of printing money like it's going out of fashion, but I do think that in a situation such as this, where we've seen in many other countries similar to our own, that this has been used to some effect. So I'm not of the view that there are no other options, and I am slightly a skeptic of looking for mechanisms outside our own immediate remit.
All right. Dr. Mondi, there is a study that I'm sure you might have seen that was done on the euro in particular and on the European countries on the effect of higher debt. And it certainly found that, for example, negative growth effects can start already from levels of around 70 to 80% of GDP. But conclusively, in that study, it says that higher public debt to GDP ratio is associated on average with lower long-term growth rates at debt levels above the range of 90 to 100% of GDP. Does the threshold really matter? Is there a magic number?
Well, it depends what that borrowing was used for. So to an extent that borrowing is used for consumption, it's likely to have a negative impact on the GDP in the long term. But if that debt, which is the cheapest form of funding, borrowing using someone's debt is the cheapest form of funding, particularly if you're using it to invest on infrastructure where you're creating efficiencies and long-term gains, where the return to that investment will lead to small, medium enterprises experiencing lower cost of doing business, employing hundreds of thousands of individuals, and paying high levels of taxes. So it depends. I mean, the Europeans, we know, they've got much more better infrastructure. They've got much better access to markets, given that it's a European Union. So I am not so sure what the money was used for. In our case, I still think that there is a case for that, as my colleague Lebo was saying. The challenge for South Africa really is that South Africa cannot look after money. We know that in the governing ANC, money leaks. Our infrastructure has fallen completely. We've got energy crisis, we've got a transport crisis, we've got a water crisis, we've got a policing crisis. So the state, as we know it, should not be encouraged to borrow more because it simply end up in people's pocket. So what's the solution? So the solution is to drive reforms. In Vulindlela, we articulate what reforms we'll be embarking on. On the energy side already, we're seeing massive investment by private sector companies who are putting in their own resources and their money to build infrastructure for themselves and those communities that they're doing business within. Where we're frustrated is around the telecom sector, where Telecom and MTN are fighting it out in court, and ICASA is caught in the middle, because if we're going to provide also those education opportunities for our children, we need lower cost of data and lower cost of entry. And with that market still very much concentrated and less regulated, the economy and the potential is going to struggle as other countries are innovating, are using digital platforms because of cheaper data, but more important also is the access because of cheapness. So these are the issues for me where I'm encouraged that the president spoke very, very well. And I'm expecting the Minister of Finance also to follow through the tune, keep taxes where they are, because many of us as middle class are already overburdened. We're overburdened by black tax, we're overburdened by high costs because we have to pay for our own health, our own education, our parents and our grandparents, because the state is failing completely. So in that regard, allow us, give us some relief, allow us to do what we can do, fix yourself as a state, get ready, use the money effectively and efficiently, and then at a particular point when we can talk about tax increases, we can talk about basic care grants, because we want a capable regime. At this juncture, I wouldn't vouch for any tax increases, or both personal as well as corporate, in the environment of corruption, of lack of capacity capability, when we know that the ANC government really looks after itself and its cronies, and leave the masses of our people in deep poverty.
Let's take a break. We'll come back. We'll hear from Prof. Bonang Mohale on that very same question. And we're taking your views as well tonight. 072-110-5584. Tweet us tonight at Newzroom 405. Is targeting a high debt level to support growth a policy option for South Africa? Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're live with us tonight on In Focus here on Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. Looking ahead to the budget speech by Finance Minister tomorrow as we talk to those issues that are facing the Finance Minister, where he would need to make decisions on. Prof, let's hear you weigh in on this. From a policy perspective, do we have a strong argument, right, for the ambitious debt reduction approach that we are taking currently as a country? Many are saying it's fiscal consolidation. Government has not really come out in those strong terms to say this is what we are doing. But if you look at the budget cuts and where things have been cut, particularly Labour, COSATU is saying it's clear fiscal consolidation. Do we have an argument for this ambitious debt reduction strategy?
So let me start first by agreeing with my two colleagues. You see, when a patient has been hit by a train, like South Africa has, you have to start by stopping the bleeding. I mean, in the first 5 years of state capture, we stole 1.5 trillion South African rands. Even today, we continue to steal at a rate of 200 billion rands a year every year. So our long-term resilience, building on short-term sustainability has to be driven by economic growth. And business is committed to working with government to drive economic growth. And a significant amount of work has been done on identifying what is needed to attract investment and drive growth and employment in South Africa. So business and government have already agreed on the bold and ambitious reform agenda of the economic reconstruction and recovery plan, and have worked together on a number of initiatives. TEMDEV, Operation Vulindlela that Lumkile is referring to, Operation Pakisa, amongst others, to effectively implement some of these reforms. So current focus has to be on monitoring delivery of the consolidated ERRP by social partners through NEDLEC. But I mean, we are sitting with the Zondo report. So business supports the findings of the report and will assist with capacity to help government implement all its findings, including secondments to the Department of Justice and the NPA if needed. We have said we'll set up an integrity fund because we know that state institutions have been hollowed out, ring-fenced only for prosecutions, managed by National Treasury to enable the NPA to appoint counsel according to Section 38 of the Constitution. But also there ought to be law and order, focus on crime and security. So we need tangible progress on bringing those responsible for the 2 weeks in July of rampant looting or the insurrection to book. Investors require both regulatory certainty and policy stability because confidence that government has the skills and the political will to prosecute and uphold the law and order. Business can scale existing support to the South African police services and prosecuting agencies to assist if required. Yeah. I think at the heart of this is investment and growth. So we need an unconditional message that South Africa is open for investment, which requires, like I said, regulatory certainty, policy stability, and interventions to improve the ease of doing business. Back to you, Nkosi.
How does borrowing have or impact on public investment? In your view, I mean, when people who want to invest in the country are looking at this country and saying, these guys are borrowing too much, does it in any way deter them? Does it affect how they view the country?
Yeah, at the moment, we are technically bankrupt because our debt to GDP ratio is approaching 80-90%. And remember, it excludes guarantees to the more than 740 state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies. When you include those, it's approaching 110%. It's not borrowing in and of itself. Before COVID, we were borrowing at a rate of 2.1 billion a day every day. Our debt servicing costs are going towards 20%. So if we could afford it, of course, it's great. But I think at this juncture, South Africa cannot afford more borrowings purely and simply because we are inefficient, we are rotten to the core, and when money comes in, like the 500 billion socio-economic stimulus as a response of the pandemic, 2/3 of that was stolen by this ANC-led government.
Yeah. Lebo, I know we're going to lose you at 8:30, so I want to just pick your brain on that particular issue that you raised on the growing deficit. Is there evidence to support that there is any benefit that we have derived from the growing deficit, right? There are instances, and I'm sure you've also raised this issue, where it is argued that a higher deficit, if it is used to finance productive public investment, it's not necessarily a bad thing. So have we shown any signs? Is there any relationship between what we have been borrowing and any signs at all of growth that we can point to?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's basically increasing a fiscal deficit is supposed to be able to boost sluggish economies by giving more money to people who can buy and invest more. So long-term deficits, however, can be quite detrimental, quite inimical to an economy, because what they do is they hamper or they distort what we're calling economic growth, and they also then distort what we feel is stability. And I think that even though there's an argument that deficits can be positive like the US model, this is not the US, and I think at some point in the indeterminate future, I'm expecting the US model to eventually begin to implode, and we can see its implosion in the huge widening gap and the racialized gaps in income and inequality, in standard of living and life outcomes even there, which are deeply racialized, not dissimilarly to South Africa. And I do think that what we should be thinking about really is how we can grow an economy much more compassionately, appreciating that certainly over the last 24 months, the extraordinary events that have occurred have only served to highlight and to spotlight much more clearly the nuances of some of the inefficiencies that Bonang and Lumkile have already highlighted previous to that. So I think the 2008 pandemic, which was a previous pandemic, was really one of many. I mean, it's a pandemic of neoliberalism. It's a pandemic of lack of state-instituted planning. It's a pandemic really of growth, which is not necessarily, which is jobless, which is accompanied by joblessness. And that goes back to far before 2008. And I think that we've seen that compared to an average of a rate of 1.9% for labor supply, there are too few jobs that are being created over the medium term. So what we can see really is that even though we're running at this deficit, I don't think that was something that we should celebrate per se and think of as a model to stand on. And I think added to that before I leave is that we do need to think much more around the sort of a transitional economy where we are consistently thinking around the safety nets that are necessary to bring everybody, the missing middle that I think that Lumkile was talking about earlier, and of course the most dispossessed, the most marginalized, and the people who are always in a situation of precarity. This precarity has only been enhanced yet again by the pandemic, but we appreciate that I've called this a pandemic among many pandemics, and it's come to show us and to teach us something. It's also come to show us the fragility of our economy, which already was sitting at a definitional unclarity around what is a job, what work actually means. This has exposed that. It's exposed the fact that people who are about the hustle, who are at traffic lights, are in some way occupied. They're in some way sustaining themselves. And what the COVID pandemic did was to remove their sources of sustainability. Yeah. And then, of course, this also means then that in the midst of all this, we are then looking at the SRD, extending that needs to come to a living wage, because we don't know how long the impact of COVID-19 among the previous other pandemics and the previous other hemorrhages, some of which are being exposed at the Zondo Commission, are going to take place. So the impact of that could be, at least in my view, 3 to 5 years before we begin to recover, given that we're still supposedly recovering from the 2008 meltdown.
Yeah. As you go, if you are the finance minister tomorrow, considering, of course, that politically fiscal consolidation measures are unpopular with voters, and you spoke earlier on of the agility of the Reserve Bank, for example, we can maybe even speak of the agility of the South African government in swiftly even implementing their own debt reduction strategy. We're still talking about, for example, the cutting down of public servants, cutting down at Eskom and so on and so forth, things that have been there for years. What do you say if you're the minister tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a few wish lists. So I think that the corporatists are looking for dividend taxes not to change. They're hoping that corporate taxes are not going to change per se. They're also hoping that they're not going to be reductions in PIT rates with full fiscal drag relief adjustments. Things around medical aid. It's a very tax heavy. I think that most of the predictions that I've seen are very tax and corporate heavy. Road accident levy might probably increase. There might be an increase in transfer duties and so forth. But I do think that we need to see a much more human-centered budget. We need to also appreciate that in all of this, we don't have an economy that's working unless the people who work that economy are also healthy, sustained, they're eating well, they have roofs over their heads. And we tend to have this separatist approach to the economy, as though the economy and the marketplace and the means of production are something that is happening somewhere over there. And yet the people who are expected to run this economy are then these separate entities who live on Mars. This cannot be so. And this budget must bring these entities together, particularly because, as Bonang has said, there is a bit of a credibility deficit, the 500 missing billion that is yet to be accounted for, which was exactly supposed to obviate and ameliorate these sorts of cracks, and instead it seems to have deepened the crevices. We need a people-centered budget which appreciates that you cannot have an economy that is functioning and that is healthy unless the people of this country feel confident in this economy and feel that they have a stake in it, that they are healthy, and that they are able to participate in the best way possible.
That's Lebohang Pheko, Research Fellow at the Trade Collective. They appreciate your time, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. When we continue next, we'll have Dr. Mondi as well as Prof. Bonang Mohale weighing in on the question of the channel through which government debt is found. Does that in any way impact on our growth and the trajectory of our growth? You can weigh in tonight on 072-110-5584 or tweet us at Newzroom405. We continue in a moment. Tonight on In Focus on Newzroom Afrika, Channel 405, ahead of the maiden budget speech of Minister We're in conversation with Dr. Lumkile Mondi and Professor Bonang Mohale. Dr. Mondi, there's a lot being said around, for example, the IMF loan, World Bank loan, and people are saying, well, it depends the channel which government actually finds this debt. For example, they speak of the trillions sitting at the PIC, that if we were to just look there, and at least borrow from there, it would put us on a better economic growth path.
You must tell those people to put their own money and give it to government. The PIC money is money of public sector employees. And we cannot put that money at risk when you know that the government is unable to manage public funds. So I've been very encouraged by how the debt management program of the Treasury is being conducted. So the idea when you're running a business is to diversify your sources of funding. So what the Treasury has done, which is exceptional, is to try and use domestic market to fund the daily needs that Professor Mohale was talking about, the 2.1 billion, the 2 billion or the 20 billion or so funding that's required from time to time. But at the same time, for long-term funding is to source from the Newzroom Bank, the BRICS Bank, get money from the IMF, from the World Bank, or the African Development Bank. So it makes sense business-wise for anyone who's running an entity to diversify your funding, because then it enables you to be able to attract different cost of funding across these different sectors and blend your cost of funds going forward. So how the South African government has done it is done very, very well. So the attractiveness or the illusion around tapping into the PIC or the central bank is based on a misunderstanding of the weaknesses where the South African government finds itself, which we've discussed this evening. That we have a state that is really not coping to manage this economy, to address the inherited challenges of the past, and cannot even run its own affairs, given what we do know about those employees at Whitfield House that have not been paid. So in an environment like that, you must protect those institutions that are functioning. So our Public Investment Corporation is working very, very well. After going through a period of pain, as we saw through the commission that we had recently, the Reserve Bank is in good hands. So in that environment, I would urge South Africans to put South Africa first and allow us to really deal with building capacity of the state whilst promoting private sector and giving space to do the things that it's supposed to do. At the same time, protecting the middle class, which at the moment is overburdened. And in that process, try and have at least a group of a strata of a society that is stable, that can carry us through in the rebuilding that Professor Bonang was talking about around the economic recovery plan. And then thereafter, once we've got these two institutions, private sector, corporate, a strong middle class that's resilient, It is easy for us, therefore, to capacitate the state to really deal with the problems of precarity that Lebu was talking about and move South Africa forward. Anything else that talks to populist ideals in a state that is incapable will lead South Africa to a wrong road. In fact, we're on that road and we're not yet weaved away from it. That is why I'm hoping that the Minister of Finance tomorrow reiterates the consolidation that Bonang was talking about. At the same time, we spend our money wisely and we look very, very hard in terms of our public sector, whether given the value and the return we're getting as a public, do we have too much people working in that sector or not? And also, in many of the SOEs, which are never going to be fixed anyway, think deeply about selling some of them, because if you cannot run them, it's no use for you to throw money into them because you can't run them. So you're throwing money into your home. So these are the ideas that people have to be pragmatic. This is not time for ideology in a country that's in crisis. This is time for pragmatism to fix South Africa and get South Africa moving forward.
But do you think policymakers are reading the signals as you're reading them?
I think the presidency and the Minister of Finance understand it. But I think around, if you look outside that, then you start asking questions, because people are caught up between the National Democratic Revolution, the NDR ideas. Others are caught up in radical economic transformation ideas, which all of them, given their capacity and capability, we know where the capacity and capability is. It is in the middle class, those that are funding privately, or everything from police, from education, from the health, and to the businesses that give opportunities to that middle class, and the wealth that's creating, that have enabled the Minister of Finance through SARS to overshoot the budget, as we'll announce tomorrow, of over 200 billion rand. If we didn't have those institutions functioning and not looking after them, I don't know what South Africa will be, given the sliding in the rule of law, given the incapability and lack of capacity in the state, that those institutions must be protected, must be nursed, and we need to encourage them to do very, very well as we fix the problems that we've just discussed this evening.
Yeah. Prof. Mohale, I know you have weighed in on this, particularly during this time of a pandemic, but as we sit now, a couple of months later, at least 2 years on, do you think this government has the ability to absorb shocks that are not compensated for by the debt-reducing measures that are in place?
No, they don't, which is exactly what the rating agencies are looking for. So they are looking for fiscal, for financial, for economic growth, but also sustainability to measure event risks. And we have proven beyond any shadow of doubt that actually we are incapable of building this short-term resilience in order to be able to look at long-term sustainability. Even if we were to flip them around, I think we are struggling. What we need as a country, as a people with great natural endowments, is to create a sustainable, inclusive growth off the back of investment. So infrastructure must be absolutely key. We need to identify and put out to bid 4, no more than 5, critical growth-enhancing infrastructure projects that business can confidently fund, because this government has no money. This is significant for job creation. Busa Lumkile Mondi is absolutely right. We also have to look at network industries. Here I'm talking about all industries that, if properly managed, aid and abet growth, and if not, inhibit growth. Here we include all ports of entry. I'm talking about harbors, rail, roads, but spectrum, electricity, and water. And then, of course, Busa Lumkile Mondi talks about a capable state. Here, we know that implementation capacity is required by government. And frankly, today, they don't have it. That's why we will work with relevant departments to identify skills gap and remedies, including secondments where they are absolutely required. But most importantly, to send a strategic conversation that says South Africa is open for business. we must send to jail the top state capture miscreants. You can't steal at an industrial scale like we did and get away with it.
Yeah.
Because, yeah.
Considering, of course, the considerable strain on public finance, then is the Finance Minister Bonang able to fund these ambitious infrastructure programs? I don't know, from the unexpected boon that we got from the commodities market during this time of COVID?
You see, what Dr. Mondi says, about 200 billion rand SARS overshoot, 75 billion of that comes just from mining. But you see, what we need to focus on, especially during this maiden budget speech, is implementation, it's on the framework, it's on the processes, structure, resources, deliverables, timeframes, but also this notion of final accountabilities. So in order to achieve regulatory certainty and policy stability, in the midst of the lowest levels of confidence, hope, and trust, we need a new social compact or this grand pact where labor can say for the next 5 years, we are not going to force double-digit wage demands, but we are really going to focus our time, energy, and effort on increasing productivity. And again, we need to go back and implement not only the Zondo Report 1 and 2, but also implement the expert panel's July Insurrection Report recommendations, but also finalize the appointment of the Chief Justice, execute on the ERRP, especially if we focus on completing the vaccine rollout and address this notion of hesitancy. Because we know that the countries that can say we have defeated and rooted out this pandemic will be able to reap the pent-up global tourism demand. For us, it matters because 10.2 million people visited our shores, and it employs 2.3 million people, 75% of whom are women, contributing about 9.8% to the national GDP. So those are the things that we really need to do. The beautiful thing about South Africa's challenges is that they are well known, well understood, and absolutely well articulated. Where we have been running short, it's the implementation, the execution, the doing. Over to you, sir.
Dr. Mondi, what do you say to the calls already coming from Labour who are saying we've been implementing this reduction in corporate tax with the hope that when companies have got money, then they will employ more people? They're saying, well, instead, all we've seen is they've taken that money and invested in mechanization, and more people are being chased out of work, and therefore, Finance Minister should be announcing the reversal of those measures tomorrow.
It's very cheap coming from Labour, given the amount of wealth they've amassed. Remember that many of our unions have got investment funds who, in fact, have invested either in their own companies, but in companies which they're talking to. So we've got companies like HCIs, among others, who are run by unionists. We've got the National Union of Manworkers Investment Company, we've got the Sakao Investment Company. You can name them. So people sometimes are disingenuous. Not only are they owning these investment firms, many of their comrades run government today, are embedded in the process of policy making. So really, it's again an interest group that has got so much power and influence that has never tackled the challenge of pushing business to ban overtime by employing more workers. Instead, they fight for overtime for the employed. So really, I mean, for Labour in South Africa, many of us are very disappointed, given the pivotal role that Labour played in the liberation of black people. Now that they're in government, they criticize their own, when in fact, they're the ones that have come up with these policies that we have. So I listen to them, but I think they can do more by themselves, working with business and working business by taking sacrifices so that we can employ more people into corporate, and thereby Labour also contributing in partnership with business in labor in the labor market and employment creation. So until they come up with innovative ideas, around how themselves can really play a role in the labor market and create opportunities for others. I really, given the political power they have in alliance with the ANC and many of them being ministers, I'll take it with a pinch of salt.
Right, as we close, let's take this WhatsApp message from Dingani in Alice. He says, the rate at which the country is borrowing money is worrisome. The main challenge will be the accountability of those funds, which has always been a problem for our country and the people who are in power. I bet there will be a stage where the government will not be able to repay all those loans. Dingan, appreciate it. Thank you very much for that message. Dr. Lumkile Mondi and Professor Bonang Mohale, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us tonight here on In Focus.